It had been 2 months now since Toomey had been stuck in the port of Shylagan in the drunken star system, and it was starting to really piss him off. The port wasn't exactly a dump hole, but Toomey had gotten there in a bad season. The great migrating current was noticeably pausing at this time and turning toward the Cygnus Arm, a sparsely populated place, so few ships were going there, and those that did go there did not suit Toomey. What was he going to do in Swan? It was the most boring backwater in the galaxy. You'd get stuck in some stupid station or planet with next to zero chances to get the hell out of there. Shylagan wasn't so bad by comparison, but Toomey wasn't used to staying in one place for long. He hadn't made any long-range plans since most of the ships he used were owned by independent traders and didn't run on a strict schedule, but he had some ideas about the route for the near future. The great festival of Decimen had always attracted stowaways. Established by the combined efforts of 38 races from all over the galaxy, from the Persis Arm to the small globular clusters of the galactic halo, it was one of the major events of the Milky Way. Everyone wanted to go there, so how could the stowaways be any worse? It was the opportunity to spend 6 months, not needing anything, everything was free at the festival, and gazing at the most incredible curiosities. Who would refuse such a thing? Actually, a ticket to the festival cost a fortune, but if you managed to get in for free, no one checked on your right to be there. This, among other things, made Decimen different from many other galactic festivals, whose organizers were not so liberal and could easily throw you out if you got caught. But the stowaways were used to it. You couldn't punish someone by throwing him out into his habitat, the endless world of star currents connecting hundreds of thousands of inhabited worlds. A stowaway would simply cling to another ship and set off on a new journey with no final destination until he found a world attractive enough to linger there for a week or two. But Toomey had been sitting on the Shylagan for over a month now, and he hadn't even chosen this world specifically for overstaying, as the stowaways called the forced stops between ship changes. The super freighter he'd taken to the drunken star system had gotten caught in a hyperspace storm on the last crossing. The season was turning, and even large calm currents like the migrating current sometimes began to churn, though certainly nowhere near as violent as the swift but dangerous currents of the storm belt, which only the captains of the most desperate clipper ships risked using. The super freighter had to travel willy-nilly to the repair docks in the Teddy Bear system. It wasn't far, and Toomey caught on to the local courier and made it to Shylagan in a couple of days. But after that, he found himself stranded. There were no other stowaways in Shylagan now. Toomey had checked all 3 of the usual local stowaway mailboxes, the hyperlink booth at the cargo port gatehouse, the outermost toilet stall in one inconspicuous bar in the port residential neighborhoods, and the 6th table in the reading room of the public library, but none of the stealth chips had records from 6 months ago. It was expectable, as there was nothing worthy of special attention on Shylagan, and the stowaways only stopped there for transfers or in rare emergencies like Toomey's. Toomey was killing time as best as he could, waiting for the right ship to come along, but it never did. He had some money, like any stowaway. When you travel invisibly all over the galaxy, you always get a chance to make some money. You buy here, sell there, moving rare little things, for example. Of course, none of the stowaways had ever laid a finger on anything serious, like drugs, weapons, or doom cells, and the local authorities almost everywhere looked the other way on petty smuggling. In addition, the stowaways created a kind of underground mail. Through them, you could always send a message or a parcel that you did not want to entrust to the office of hyperlink companies or postal control, provided that there was no rush in these shipments. Of course, with the same restrictions about really serious stuff. Toomey had even managed to retrofit his pod with some useful gadgets, bargaining cheaply with a small dock workshop that had fallen on hard times and was willing to take orders from anyone, even a stowaway. But that didn't get him one step closer to his main goal, to get the hell out of Shy-Lagan. Toomey had been a stowaway for 6 years now since he'd turned 11, and old Young was actually only 26, but he was an old man to the other stowaways, had given him his pod when he retired and settled on Tramdelane 5. But until now, Toomey had never been stuck anywhere for so long. Storm season was looming with each passing day. Toomey realized that he would have no chance of getting out of the drunken star system before it was over, and he was almost ready to hitch a ride on the first ship he could find, wherever it was headed, whether it was to the Cygnus Arm or Andromeda. But as luck would have it, the thin stream of transit ships had dried up. The captains of the merchant fleet didn't want to risk their cargoes and crews, so they were forced to bail until better times. The only ships still leaving Shy-Lagan now were military and government couriers, but they were the exact ones any stowaway wouldn't risk picking on. Unlike the freighters and passenger liners, the military and government officials were cautious in determining if they carried anyone not identified on the ship's roll or cargo manifests. Sure, a few months on the Shy-Lagan didn't sound like a happy vacation, but spending a couple or 3 years in a federal correctional facility was much less to Toomey's liking. On one of the endless days filled with dull waiting, Toomey had nothing to do but look through all the records he'd downloaded from the stealth chips in the stowaways' hiding places. The earliest of them had been made about 40 standard years ago. Toomey hadn't even been born then, but on the other hand, the stowaways had been racing around the galaxy for at least 200 years. Either they'd used a different warning system before, or never strayed onto this stupid Shy-Lagan. Toomey looked out the window of the room he'd rented in the port district. At first, the uneven flickering of the drunken star annoyed him, but then he'd gotten used to it, and almost stopped noticing it. Now, he was getting angry again. He'd read somewhere that it used to be thought that such flickering stars couldn't have habitable planets, but Shy-Lagan had apparently been unaware of that rule. Not that its rugged steppes and mountains were teeming with life, but there was enough of it to provide the planet with an oxygen atmosphere, and humans had not failed to take advantage of that to build another boring spaceport on their way from nowhere to nowhere. Some of the recent names in the records were familiar to him. Transferred from the Zabeldarn to the Pride of Ankel, day 246 of year 4867, Monopore. With Monopore, he'd even had a great time together once. They'd both hitched a ride on a cruise ship from the Mist Cluster and had a nice ride all over the galaxy, eating out in the vast dining halls and even making a little extra money in the ship's dozens of casinos. It's easy for two boys to get lost among 50,000 passengers. Incidentally, during the last gathering at the Big Can, as the stowaways called the abandoned station, they had adapted for their meetings. Someone had told Toomey that no one had seen Monopore since 4867. 3 years. Toomey wondered if his friend had quit or if he'd just gotten somewhere too far away. Been stalling for a week now, bored to death. Rumor has it there's a big freighter coming through for Comarat. I guess I'll have to cling on. 110th day of the year, 4868, Chang'e. Toomey had only met Chang'e a couple of times, but he didn't mind getting to know her better. He liked this swarthy, cheerful girl, restless, and always up for new adventures. Strange. It suddenly occurred to Toomey that Chang'e hadn't been seen for a while either. He himself had been on Comarat not that long ago, no more than 6 months, and none of the stealth chips had any records from Chang'e. Maybe the freighter had changed course, or she'd ended up hitching a ride with another ship. Toomey hated to think of another possibility, which, unfortunately, was far more likely: Canson service. The damned Stowaway Catching Bureau was, strictly speaking, a private enterprise. But lately, more and more transportation companies and even privateer captains had been using its services. Toomey wondered why. The stowaways did not cause any particular damage to these companies, for the weight of the stowaway pod was insignificant compared to the weight of the entire ship to which the stowaway clung. The energy consumption never exceeded the error of calculations, so it was almost impossible to figure that you were carrying a stowaway. Stowaways tried to behave as decently as possible, not to steal cargo, not to harass passengers, and certainly not be seen by the crew. But the Canson service pressed the pride of the carriers, saying that stowaway on the ship sounds not respectable and damages the company's reputation. Their ubiquitous micro-drones swarmed around the customers' ships, detecting the stowaway pods despite the good camouflage fields. If this keeps up, it will soon be a challenging time for the stowaways. Toomey ran through a few more entries of unfamiliar stowaway as he saw another name he knew. Waiting for a hitch at Nauskow. Barely had time to jump off the clipper from the blue corner. Damn, the captain almost didn't slow down at Drunken Star. I would never mess with those crazy clippers again, I swear. Day 5 of the year 4869, Mosno. Toomey had no time to ponder this entry before his comm buzzed sharply. Toomey was alarmed. It looked like the Trojan viruses he'd launched into the Sci-Fi spaceport's data system had been triggered. Some large ship was entering the spaceport's control zone. Lines of data stolen by the Stowaway's Trojan from the spaceport control room database ran across the comm screen. Home port, Chatzag 2. Toomey had no idea where that was. Owner, Chatzag Freighters, same thing. Name of the ship, a set of numbers and letters, no romance in the owner. Mass of the ship. Toomey whistled. The ship was huge, several times larger than the super freighter on which Toomey had arrived on Sci-Fi. Not even large hyperstorms, except for the most powerful ones, could hurt something like that. Toomey glanced at his destination and immediately jumped up. There was not a second to lose. The ship was headed for the Keshtamon system. He couldn't have been more lucky. The huge station being prepared for the festival was literally in the neighborhood of the Keshtamon. Toomey thought about that while running to the small private dock where his pod stood. One of the reasons for the emergence and relative prosperity of Sci-Fi was that several different hypercurrents were running close to the Drunken Star. No ship could travel the galaxy fast enough without utilizing these currents, which spread like an immense spider web throughout the galaxy. In the Drunken Star system, it was possible not only to slow down and pause for resupply and minor repairs, but also to jump out of one current and enter another, changing direction. Toomey raced through space in his pod, continuously checking the data from the control room. The giant ship had no plans to stop in the system, but to change currents, it needed to drop speed, and Toomey had to catch that moment to lock onto it. The task wasn't that difficult. Most of the work was done by automation, but any mistake threatened disaster. As usual, a huge ship leaving the current appeared on the screens completely unexpectedly, even though the estimated exit point had been calculated almost to the last meter. Toomey saw the unremarkable area of space first fill with an orange-yellow glow and swirl with dark veins, and then the giant ship's long hull emerged. Toomey immediately noted the unfamiliar shape of the hull. Usually, practical considerations won over aesthetic ones in larger ships' designs. Most super freighters and even passenger liners were almost shapeless collections of angular modules connected by a multitude of passages and support structures. But this ship looked different. It was as if someone had strung several elongated cones and spheres on a central axis, and then decorated the whole structure with surprisingly symmetrical protrusions and spikes. Toomey had never seen anything like it in his life. The galaxy is huge, though. All sorts of stuff exist in it. Following a parallel course, Toomey caught up with the ship and slowed down a little, synchronizing the pod's speed with the ship's. Now, all that was left to do was to choose a place to hitch up. He excluded the spheres covered with a mass of some growths and structures. Too easy to hit something. On the second cone, Toomey noticed one good place, almost devoid of any protruding features. Some were still present, but in much smaller numbers. With a short, graceful maneuver, the grapple field engaged, and the pod dropped gently to the hull of the carrier ship. Daddy, as the stowaways called it in their lingo. Toomey let out a long sigh of relief. Finally, he was in his familiar surroundings, and finally, he was off this damned Shylagan. He wasn't afraid of the Canson service now either. They could only track stowaways in normal space. When the ship dipped into hypercurrent, drones were useless, and this giant was due to go into current again very soon. At this mass, the most advantageous thing to do was to maintain as much velocity as possible while transitioning from one current to another. Toomey ran a standardized protocol that the stowaways called Weasel. The protocol was to find the frequencies of the ship's internal control systems, crack the codes, and plug Toomey directly into them. This helped with security and reduced the likelihood of detection, in addition to straightforward means such as stealth fields. For example, if there were security cameras inside the ship, the protocol entered Toomey as a crew member into their firmware. It also blocked the frames he appeared on from being output to the ship's central console. In the case of passenger ships, the protocol could even put Toomey in the ship's role, allowing him to, for example, occupy a vacant cabin, if there were any, and eat in the restaurant. Not a bad bonus compared to the rather Spartan life in the pod. While the protocol worked, Toomey scrutinized the part of the ship that was now visible on the camera. Interestingly, those protrusions on the hull reminded him of something remotely familiar. They looked strange, not like artificial structures, but more like something living, something that had sprouted through the hull of the ship or grown over some object located on the plating. The distant ones looked like vague bumps, but the nearer ones. Out of idle curiosity, Toomey fired up the narrow beam scanner, aiming it at the nearest bump. After a few seconds of static on the screen, the outline of what was inside the outgrowth began to emerge. Very familiar outlines. He remembered Masno's pod from the first time they met 4 years ago. Unlike most pods converted from small lifeboats, Masno's pod had once been an in-system small courier skimmer, and it was easily recognized by its elongated, pointy-nosed hull. At this distance, the scanner's power gave excellent resolution, and Toomey saw with horror that although the pod's hull was intact, Masno himself was still inside, or rather, his mummy. Toomey jerked frantically to turn off the scanner but froze halfway through. It suddenly occurred to him that the entire hull of the ship was dotted with such growths. There were dozens, hundreds, no, thousands. He remembered old Jung's legends about the trap ship that traveled the galaxy, picking up the careless stowaways. Stupid stories that everyone laughed at, including Jung himself. Yes, every once in a while, a stowaway would disappear, but no one paid much attention to it. Sadly, risk was an integral part of their lives. You could miss docking and break the pod, be blown off the hull in a storm, or fall into the clutches of a particularly badly disposed crew, or get caught on a giant ship. Toomey pulled the emergency release handle with all his might, already guessing how it would end. The pod didn't even move. Glancing at the forward screen, he saw that some dark substance was already crawling along the front strut, very much like the shell under which Masno's tomb had been hidden. In a desperate attempt to do something about it, Tume turned to the terminal controlling the protocol, only to see the screen glowing a steady white light without a single symbol. He pressed enter and then the shutdown key, all to no avail. At that moment, a shrill alarm filled the pod's cockpit. Tume looked at the navigation screen and went cold. A menacing red line flashed there. Dangerous course change, immediate undocking recommended. All the stowaway pods were equipped with special detectors that triggered when the hypercurrents intensified or changed sharply. As a last resort, it provided a theoretical way to undock in time with a ship that suddenly decided to take a wrong turn. However, Tume had never heard of anyone successfully using it. Now he knew why. No one had. The data on the screen told him that the trap ship had turned onto a narrow but swift current instead of its planned course, leading to the most dangerous region of the galaxy, a huge hyperspace vortex at its very center, a giant maelstrom conjugated to a black superhole, and an unknown destination. At the very last moment, when the ship finally left normal space and began to rapidly pick up incomprehensible speed, tearing Tume's consciousness apart, all the screens went out, and in Tume's head, a multi-voiced chorus sounded in which he recognized the voices of Masno, Changa, Manipur, and many, many others. Hello, Tume. Welcome to the family. Now you're finally home. Forever.